year was 1823, in the low red clay country of Virginia, where the soil itself seemed to breathe through the summers, swollen with humidity, thick as blood. The fields around Cold Ash Hollow had once belonged to proud planters, but by then they had turned to dust and ruin. The men gone to debt, the women gone to fever, the land gone to silence. And in the middle of it all, in a leaning whitewashed cottage choked with vines and the stink of pigs, lived Elspeth Harrow, the midwife of the hollow. She was not born there. Some said she came from the mountains, a widow whose husband died of cholera, a woman who learned the trade from the Scots-Irish healers, who mixed herbs with hymns and read omens in the stillborns' eyes. Others whispered that she had once been a nursemaid to the governor's wife, until a child went missing and Elspeth vanished before sunrise. But no one could prove anything, and when the crops failed and the women began to lose their babies, they came to her all the same. In those parts, faith was weaker than fear. Her cottage stood beside a fenced pig pen, 10 beasts strong, fat, pink and filthy, rooting endlessly in the damp clay. She kept them as any woman might keep chickens, though there was something almost tender in the way she fed them, calling them by name under her breath. The animals watched her with a strange attentiveness, as if they understood her grief better than the townsfolk ever could. For Elspeth had known loss. 2 stillbirths of her own. The first, a girl born in a winter so bitter it split the bark from trees. The second, a boy who never opened his mouth to cry, though she had prayed until her throat bled. She buried both in the orchard behind her house, but the orchard had long since died, and so, perhaps, had her faith. When the first mother came knocking, it was already too late. A pale, trembling woman named Ruth Alton, her shift soaked with blood and fear. The child was turned wrong, the husband shouting for God and whiskey in equal measure. Elspeth moved like a shadow in that small cabin, her voice steady, her hands colder than iron. She worked for hours by lamplight, until dawn crept grey through the shutters. Then silence, the stillness of failure. Ruth's child was born lifeless. The mother wailed and struck Elspeth across the face, calling her cursed. The husband buried the infant in a shoebox under the sycamore. But before he could finish the prayer, Elspeth saw the flies already gathering. The clay was too wet to close, and by morning the dogs had unearthed the box. That night, Elspeth carried what was left back to her farm. The pigs stirred restlessly, squealing and pressing their snouts through the slats. She stood before them, trembling, the moonlight pooling silver on the corpse in her arms. The child weighed almost nothing, just skin, bone, and silence. She thought of how the world took everything that was meant to live and left her with rot. She thought of hunger, hers and theirs. The pigs watched as she stepped into the sty. When she left, there was no child to bury. In the weeks that followed, the whispers began. The townsfolk said the pigs had grown too fat too fast, their eyes too human. A stable boy swore he heard crying from the pen at night. Soft, wet cries like an infant trying to breathe through mud. The rumors reached the church by midsummer, and the parishioners demanded that Reverend Abel come and bless the Harrow land. But the Reverend was old and near blind, and his fear of the swamp road outweighed his faith. So Elspeth remained alone, except for the women who needed her. They came at all hours, laboring, screaming, weeping. And one by one the infants came out still, some blue, some half-formed, some already cold. Elspeth did all she could, cut the cords, pressed their chests, whispered psalms through gritted teeth. But nothing worked. It was as if the hollow itself had turned against birth. After each death, she buried the bodies in the orchard, though the ground grew harder to dig. The pigs lingered near the edge, grunting and pawing at the fence as if waiting. The sound made her nauseous. Still, she could not ignore the way their eyes followed her, patient and intelligent. By the 5th stillbirth that year, something inside her broke. She began to keep the infant's remains in her cellar, wrapped in linens hidden among herbs and jars of tinctures. She told herself it was for study, that she might find a cure, that she might learn what cursed these women. But deep down she knew it was something else. The longer the bodies stayed, the stronger the smell of the earth inside her house. And at night, she dreamed of hands reaching up through the clay, pale and tiny, clawing toward her. The pigs grew restless, breaking their troughs, squealing in the moonlight. Their cries echoed like the wails of hungry children, and one night she could bear it no longer. She brought the linen bundle from the cellar, walked barefoot through the wet grass, and stood before the pen. The pigs gathered close, their breath steaming in the chill. She opened the cloth and whispered something, not a prayer, not quite a curse, and let the body fall. When the feeding began, she did not turn away. Days became weeks. Each new death in the village found its way eventually to Elspeth's farm. Some were brought to her by desperate parents begging her to save them. Others found by accident in her care. She told herself she did it to keep them from rot, from dogs, from worms. But the truth was simpler. It gave her peace. Watching the pigs devour what the world had rejected felt like an act of terrible mercy. Yet mercy has a way of souring. In August, the fever came, a crimson sickness that crept from the lowlands, leaving women pale and delirious. The newborns came sooner, smaller, deformed. One night, as Elspeth leaned over a dying mother, the woman's eyes rolled back and she whispered that her child was still alive, deep inside her, clawing to stay. But when Elspeth reached for the body, it was cold. That night, Elspeth dreamed again of a pig with a human mouth, whispering her name. When she awoke, the smell of decay was everywhere. The orchard was slick with mud, the sty broken open. The pigs had escaped. She found them rooting in the graves behind her house, grunting as they uncovered the soft remains she had buried there. The sight sent her to her knees. She screamed until her voice broke, beating them with sticks. But they only scattered and returned, their faces caked with flesh and soil. From that morning on, Elspeth could not look at them without trembling. She tried to sell them in the next town, but no trader would touch them. One said they stank of death. Another swore their eyes followed him as he walked away. So she kept them, because what else could she do? But something in them had changed. They no longer ate the slop she poured into the troughs. Only when she brought the linen bundles from the cellar did they stir, low and eager, waiting for her to feed them, and she did. Not out of madness, but out of devotion. Because by then, she had begun to believe that something holy had taken root inside her pigs, that the dead had found a new kind of life within them. She watched them under the moon and saw shapes in their shadows, tiny human forms crawling beneath their skin. The thought filled her with both terror and awe. The villagers began to keep their distance. Women whispered that the midwife's hands were cursed, that her touch brought death to every crib. Men claimed her chimney belched black smoke that stank of iron and milk. But no one dared confront her, not yet. For in every house another woman was with child. And in every birth there was the same fear, that the first cry might never come, and somewhere in that dread, that quiet, unspoken terror, Elspeth found her power. She would walk through the village with her black shawl pulled tight, her eyes downcast. Men crossed the street to avoid her. Children threw stones and then ran, though none ever struck her. The air seemed to twist around her as she passed, heavy and cold. The midwife who brought death, the woman whose pigs sang at night. It was not until autumn that a stranger came, a man in a long coat carrying a Bible bound in cracked leather. He called himself Father Silas, newly assigned to the parish. His voice was calm, his eyes dark as peat. He asked about the midwife. The women crossed themselves and whispered her name. He nodded slowly, saying only that such things cannot be allowed to fester. That was the beginning of her end. Though she did not yet know it, that night, as rain battered the roof and wind shrieked through the chimney, Elspeth sat by her window, watching the pig pen sway under the storm. In the flash of lightning, she thought she saw movement, not of pigs, but of something smaller, crawling on 2 legs instead of 4. She told herself it was madness or guilt or grief, but in her heart, she knew the truth. Something was being born in her sty, something that should never have lived. By early September, the air in Cold Ash Hollow thickened with decay. The cornfields wilted to brittle stalks, and the sky carried a constant grey weight, as if mourning something no one dared to name. In the evenings, a low mist crept through the hollows and lay heavy over Elspeth Harrow's farm, swallowing the orchard, the sty, the graves. The townsfolk began to avoid the road that led past her gate, whispering that the fog itself was born from her chimney. But for Elspeth, silence had become a kind of prayer. She spent her mornings steeping herbs, her afternoons tending to expectant mothers, and her nights feeding the pigs. The rhythm soothed her, the sameness of it. She moved through her days as though guided by a hand she could not see. Yet something was changing, not just in her, but in the earth itself. It began with the smell. The damp soil behind her house, where she had once buried the stillborns, now exhaled a sweetness that made her dizzy. When she walked there, she felt a soft tremor beneath her feet, like a heartbeat pulsing through the ground. Sometimes, if she lingered, she could almost hear a faint humming, a sound between breathing and singing, too low for any human ear to name. She told herself it was the fever. She had seen it spread through the countryside, women growing pale and weak, their babies sickly and silent. Yet when she looked into the mothers' faces, she saw something more than sickness. A shadow that mirrored her own, each birth blurred into the next. She lost count of the infants that came without breath, their tiny chests unmoving despite her desperate ministrations. The other midwives had long since stopped answering her letters. In her solitude, she began to read the Book of Job by candlelight, tracing each line with trembling fingers, searching for meaning in the suffering. It was there that Father Silas found her. He came one evening without warning, walking up the muddy path with his cassock trailing in the dirt. She saw him from her window and felt an unease coil in her stomach. There was something unnatural about the way he moved, too steady, too deliberate, as though he already knew what he would find. When he knocked, she did not answer. But he spoke through the door, his voice low and calm. He said he had come to bless her house, to bring her peace. Elspeth nearly laughed at the word. Peace had left her years ago, buried under the orchard with the bones of her children. At last she opened the door. He stood there, tall and lean, rain dripping from his hat brim. His face was kind, but his eyes were the color of wet coal. He looked around the dim cottage, taking in the jars of tinctures, the hanging herbs, the smoldering fire. When his gaze fell on the cellar door, something flickered behind his calm expression. A spark of suspicion, quickly buried beneath a smile. He asked her if she still attended births. She nodded. He asked if she prayed for the souls of the children who died in her care. She hesitated. Then she told him she did what she could, but that prayer had done her little good. He did not rebuke her. He simply touched the crucifix at his chest and murmured that all sins come to light, in time. Before leaving, he handed her a vial of holy water. He told her to sprinkle it on her thresholds and in her well to ward off corruption. But when she lifted it later that night, she found the water inside had already turned cloudy, as though something in her touch had spoiled it. That same night, the pigs began to scream. She woke to the sound, sharp and frantic like a child's cry. She ran to the sty with her lantern swinging wildly, her nightdress plastered to her skin with rain. The pen was splintered, the ground churned to mud. The pigs thrashed and rammed against the boards, their snouts bleeding, their bodies slick with filth. She lifted the lantern and froze. One of them had something in its mouth, a pale shape, limp and small, glistening in the light. For a moment, she thought it was another piglet, but then she saw the tiny hand, curled and perfect, pressed against its snout. Her scream cut through the rain like a blade. She stumbled forward, striking at the beast with a shovel until it dropped the thing and scurried back. What fell into the mud was not a child, and not exactly. Its skin was translucent, its limbs twisted, its face smooth where eyes should have been. She fell to her knees, trembling. The creature made no sound, but its body pulsed faintly, as though something still lived within it. Then it dissolved, collapsing into the soil like wax into flame, leaving behind only a dark stain that smelled of iron. When she looked up, every pig in the pen was watching her. From that night onward, Elspeth could not sleep. The dreams came faster, darker, the pigs whispering in the voices of the dead, calling her by name. She began hearing them even when awake. faint murmurs that drifted through the walls, through the earth itself. The villagers noticed her decline. Some swore they saw her walking through the graveyard at dawn, her skirts dragging through the dew, her face pale as the tombstones. Others claimed she carried something wrapped in linen through the fields at night. The more they whispered, the less she cared. Let them talk. Let them fear her. Because she had begun to believe the whispers herself. She felt it in her blood, that she was marked, chosen for something. The stillbirths, the pigs, the fever, all threads of the same design. She could feel it pulling her toward revelation. If the priest's God would not speak to her, then something else would. She started to keep a book of her own, a ledger of the dead children, written not in names but in symbols. Circles, lines, and crosses, copied from old medical texts she had inherited from her mother. Each mark corresponded to a life lost, a breath that never came. She found herself tracing the marks late at night, humming softly to herself. But the pigs would not let her rest. Their bodies began to change. Their hides grew mottled and pale. Their eyes, once dull and black, gleamed with a strange reflective sheen. She swore she saw human shapes writhing beneath their skin, like shadows struggling to surface. Sometimes, when she fed them, she could hear the faintest echo of a baby's cry, soft, pleading, lost. One morning, as she was pouring slop into the trough, she heard a voice behind her. It was Father Silas. He had returned without warning, his boots clean despite the mud. He asked if she'd seen anything strange of late. She told him no, her tone sharp, but he stepped past her and peered into the pen. The pigs had gone still, their heads raised, their eyes fixed on him. He frowned, muttered a prayer under his breath, and made the sign of the cross. The pigs began to squeal, thrashing violently, pressing against the fence as if trying to escape. Silas stepped back, his calm mask breaking for the first time. He told her the land was unclean, that something beneath it hungered for souls. He warned her that if she did not repent, she would be consumed. When he left, Elspeth felt her knees weaken, not from fear but from recognition, because she already knew the land was hungry. She had been feeding it all along. Over the next weeks, she saw fewer women. The fever had taken many, and those who survived found other midwives, even if it meant traveling miles. The isolation deepened her descent. Her only companions were the pigs and the thing that whispered through them, the thing that now lived inside the soil. The earth around her house began to move in subtle ways. The ground sank in places as though hollow beneath. Mushrooms bloomed in circles overnight. The air itself seemed thicker, full of motes that glittered faintly in moonlight. And in her dreams, she saw them, the children she had lost, crawling from the earth covered in mud. Their mouths filled with straw, their eyes like mirrors. They called to her, not in accusation but in invitation. One night she followed their voices to the orchard. The trees were nothing but blackened stumps now, twisted like ribs. She fell to her knees among the graves and pressed her palms into the soil. It felt warm, almost alive, and deep within that warmth she felt a stirring. Something vast and slow, turning like a heartbeat beneath the ground. She whispered into the earth, asking what it wanted from her. The answer came not as words, but as sensation, hunger, endless and patient. The pigs began to wail again, their cries echoing like a chorus of infants. The sound rolled across the hollow, reaching even the distant town. People woke in their beds and crossed themselves. And in the church, Father Silas opened his eyes from restless sleep, knowing that the hour he dreaded had come. By dawn, smoke rose from Elspeth's chimney, black and thick. A smell of burning flesh drifted through the valley, and from her orchard came the sound of something breaking through the soil. The bells of St. Catherine's Chapel rang hollow that autumn, their sound brittle and uncertain, echoing down the hollow like the last heartbeat of a dying thing. The congregation had thinned to nearly nothing. The fever had taken so many, and those who still came to pray did so not from faith but fear. They crossed themselves 3 times at the mention of the midwife's name, and when Father Silas passed with his incense, their eyes followed him with a pleading that bordered on accusation. He had not come to Cold Ash Hollow for peace. He had come because no other priest would. The parish had lost its shepherd to cholera the year before, and the bishop in Richmond had sent Silas as punishment, a quiet exile for a man who had failed too many confessions. He had carried guilt of his own, though he never spoke of it. A child buried too young, a woman's voice that haunted his prayers. He believed he had come to serve God in penance. But when he first heard the whispers of the midwife and her pigs, something inside him stirred. Not devotion, but recognition. It began with the graves. The churchyard, long overgrown, had begun to move. The sexton, a mute man who lived in the rectory loft, brought Silas to see it one morning. The soil around the infant plots had sunk in soft depressions, as though something beneath had shifted. Silas knelt beside one and touched the earth. It pulsed faintly under his hand, warm, breathing. He ordered the graves consecrated again, but the feeling did not leave him. In his sleep he heard scratching beneath the floorboards. When he prayed, the words of the Psalms blurred into something older. He began to dream of pigs, vast and black, with faces like children's, their eyes milky and unseeing. By late September, the townsfolk began to vanish. A widow gone from her bed, a farmhand found half buried in the orchard mud. They whispered that wolves had returned to the valley, but Silas knew better. He had seen the tracks himself. Not paw prints, not human, but something in between. One evening he stood outside the chapel and watched the sky darken toward storm. In the distance, a single column of smoke rose from the direction of the Harrow farm. He knew then he could wait no longer. He carried with him a crucifix, a bottle of holy oil, and a rusted pistol that had belonged to his father. His hands shook as he loaded it. The rain began before he reached the hollow, soft at first, then pounding like fists on the leaves. The road was slick with red clay. Each step sank deep, as though the ground itself resisted him. When he reached her gate, the air changed. The smell was thick, iron, rot, and something sweeter beneath, like spoiled milk. He called her name once. No answer. The pigs stirred restlessly behind the fence, their bodies shivering in the lantern glow. He stepped closer and his breath caught. Their eyes reflected the light in shades of amber and green, too human, too knowing. He whispered a prayer and scattered holy oil through the slats. The pig screamed, a sound so shrill it made his bones vibrate. One threw itself against the fence until its body split, and from the wound spilled not blood, but a pale, waxy fluid crawling with movement. The priest stumbled back, choking, his cross trembling in his hand. The cottage door opened then, slow and deliberate. Elspeth Harrow stood framed in the doorway, her face half-shadowed by lamplight. Her hair hung in damp ropes over her shoulders, her nightdress stained dark to the knees. In her arms she held something wrapped in cloth. Father Silas called her by name, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. He told her the Lord would forgive her if she confessed, if she turned away from her sin. But Elspeth did not move. She stepped forward into the rain, and he saw what she carried. It was small, and it moved, weakly, twitching beneath the fabric. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a piglet, hairless, its skin pale and translucent, its face disturbingly human. It opened its mouth and let out a faint, gurgling cry. Silas raised his crucifix, shouting scripture, the words breaking against the thunder. Elspeth only watched him, eyes glassy with exhaustion. She whispered something, soft and broken, that the rain nearly drowned out. "They are not dead," she said. "None of them ever died." The ground trembled. From the orchard came a low groan, as though the earth itself was shifting. Silas turned, lantern swinging wildly. In the darkness, the graves had begun to open, soil cracking, roots twisting upward, and beneath, shapes were moving. Pale, glistening, crawling through the mud toward the surface. He ran toward them, cross raised high, reciting the only prayer that came to mind. But when the first of the shapes broke free, his words failed. It was a child, or what had once been one, its body bloated, its eyes black pits of mud. It dragged itself forward, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He stumbled back, firing the pistol. The gunshot tore through the air, but the thing did not stop. More were rising now, dozens, their tiny hands clawing through the soil. And behind them, the pigs squealed and threw themselves against the pen, desperate to escape. Elspeth's voice rose above the chaos, a single guttural wail that made the air shudder. She dropped the creature in her arms and fell to her knees in the mud, clutching her head as if it were splitting open. The rain poured harder, washing the graves clean, and from the depths of the orchard came a sound that silenced everything. A low, resonant moan that seemed to come from the belly of the earth. The graves stopped moving. The pigs went still. Even the storm faltered, then the ground split. A crack opened beneath the priest's feet, wide and steaming. From it rose a stench so thick it coated his tongue. Something glimmered deep below, not light but movement. He caught only fragments as it surfaced, flesh and mud intertwined, limbs sprouting from places they shouldn't, faces half formed and half melted. The thing climbed upward, dragging itself into the world like a birth gone wrong. Its voice was a chorus of infants crying from the same throat. Silas stumbled back, shouting prayers that turned to screams. Elspeth rose, eyes wide with ecstasy, her arms outstretched. "You see?" she whispered. "They were waiting for me." The creature reached her. Its hand, if it could be called that, brushed her face with something like tenderness. She smiled, tears mixing with rain, and then without hesitation, she stepped forward into its arms. The thing enfolded her, pulling her into itself. There was no struggle, no sound, only the sucking noise of mud closing around flesh. The priest turned and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the church, soaked and shaking. He locked the doors and fell before the altar, gasping prayers through sobs. He told himself it was over, that the Lord had shown him the wages of blasphemy. But when dawn came, the fog had already crept down from the hills. It rolled through the town like breath, carrying with it the smell of the orchard. And beneath the chapel floor, faint but steady, came the sound of something breathing. By the time autumn pressed its weight upon the valley, the Harrow farm had become a thing whispered about only when the lamps were out. The priest's visits had grown more frequent and more desperate, yet every sermon he gave left him thinner, paler, as though each word was feeding something that wasn't God. The townsfolk claimed they saw him walking toward Elspeth's fields at midnight, muttering prayers that bled into curses, a crucifix clutched like a weapon. They said he always came back trembling, his clothes soaked not with rain, but with the same dark muck that oozed from the pigpen. The animals no longer resembled swine. Their hides had stretched in strange places, mottled with scars and growths that pulsed faintly beneath the skin. When they moved, it sounded less like hooves striking soil and more like something dragging itself through wet earth. Their snouts had shortened, their eyes widened. They did not grunt anymore. They breathed, slow, deliberate, and human. And when Elspeth passed them, they followed her with those eyes, blinking like infants learning to focus. She had stopped counting the nights. Time moved differently now. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting a reddish haze that stained everything it touched. Inside her house, the air smelled of herbs, blood, and something sweetly spoiled. She hadn't cleaned her birthing tools in weeks. They sat in a basin of brown water, the metal spotted with rust that looked like dried hearts. Each morning she found small footprints in the mud near her door. Not the cloven marks of pigs, but the soft human impressions of tiny feet. Bare, delicate, almost translucent. They never led toward or away from anything, just appeared and vanished, like ghosts born from dew. Once, before dawn, she opened her door and saw a small figure standing near the pen. A child, naked, its body wet as though newly born. It turned its head toward her, but the motion was wrong, as if its neck remembered the movement, but its bones did not. She called out softly, though she didn't know what name to use. The thing smiled with lips too wide and teeth too many, then slipped between the boards of the fence as if its flesh was smoke. The next day, Father Silas returned. His hands shook as he crossed himself in the yard, though his eyes carried none of the mercy his collar suggested. "You've brought something back that was never meant to rise," he muttered, his voice cracking with the effort of faith. Elspeth said nothing. She no longer felt anger or shame, only inevitability. He demanded entry, speaking of purification, of cleansing the soil with holy water. She stepped aside and let him in. The house had changed since his last visit. Strange marks covered the walls, carved in the same looping script Elspeth once used to label tinctures and tonics. The priest didn't recognize the words, though his skin crawled when he looked at them. On the table lay a bowl filled with something dark and thick, its surface rippling though there was no breeze. In the corner, a cradle rocked itself, slow and rhythmic though empty. The sound of it filled the space like a heartbeat. He opened his Bible, but the pages were blank. He flipped through them wildly, breath hitching until he found one passage scrawled in crimson ink. From the flesh of the fallen, life shall feed life. The handwriting was hers. When he turned, Elspeth was already watching him. Her face glowed in the dim light, half in shadow, half illuminated by the flickering hearth. She looked neither alive nor dead, only suspended between both states. "You think you can burn this away?" she said softly, her voice the hush of wind through reeds. "But it's already in you, in all of us." Outside, the pigs had begun to scream, not in panic but in hunger. The sound tore through the valley, echoing off the hills like the wailing of 100 infants. The priest dropped his Bible, stumbling backward as the walls of the cottage began to pulse, expanding and contracting as if the house itself were breathing. From the hearth came the smell of scorched flesh, and the shadows danced with a feverish intelligence, twisting into shapes of small, grasping hands. Elspeth moved to the window. "They're coming to feed," she whispered. Her tone carried a terrible calm, like a mother preparing supper. The priest tried to flee, but the door would not open. Something wet and soft pressed against it from outside, pushing, gurgling, seeking entrance. When he looked through the crack, an eye stared back, pink, veined and unmistakably human. The pigs, if they could still be called that, had gathered. Their bodies writhed together, melding into one mass of quivering, fleshy forms. Some crawled on limbs that were no longer their own. Others dragged themselves by hands instead of hooves. Their faces bore remnants of infants, noses too small, lips trembling, eyes milky but aware. They pressed against the house, moaning in a dreadful chorus that sounded like the wind sobbing through broken reeds. Father Silas began reciting prayers, but each word turned sour in his mouth. His tongue swelled until he could no longer speak. The floorboards beneath him trembled. From the cracks seeped a thin trickle of blood that spread outward, forming slow-moving rivers around his boots. He stumbled toward the window, but Elspeth stood in his path. Her eyes were not her own anymore. They reflected the same dull luminescence as the creatures outside. "They were never meant to live," she said, her voice now two voices, a woman and a child entwined. But something wanted them still. Something beneath the soil. Her skin rippled as she spoke, and for a moment the priest thought he saw small shapes moving beneath it, pressing outward, trying to be born. She smiled, a slow, dreadful thing, and reached for his hand. "You wanted to save them. Now you will." The door gave way with a wet crack. The creatures poured in, filling the room like a flood of living mud. The priest screamed as they crawled up his legs, their mouths opening and closing against his flesh. Elspeth stood among them, untouched, arms outstretched as though welcoming children home. The creatures began to merge with her, their bodies sinking into hers until her form bulged and twisted. The air filled with the sound of slurping and sucking, a grotesque lullaby that drowned out the priest's last words. When silence returned, the house was empty. The cradle had stopped rocking. Outside, the night glowed faintly red, as though the soil itself had been set aflame. By dawn, the Harrow farm was gone. The house had collapsed into the earth, leaving only a pit surrounded by crows and a few fragments of timber slick with grease. The priest's Bible was found a mile away, its pages fused together with something that smelled faintly of milk. The townsfolk buried what remained and salted the ground, but the fields never grew right again. The pigs that strayed too close to that hollow would give birth to things that didn't squeal, things that breathed like people and smiled when the moon was full. And on windless nights, when the air turned heavy and the soil steamed with dew, the farmers swore they could still hear it, the lullaby of the midwife, humming to her children beneath the earth. By the time the first frost crawled over the valley, the name Elspeth Harrow had become a curse no one dared speak after dark. The church lay empty, its bell fallen from the tower, and Father Silas's house remained locked, its windows blackened with soot from the night the heavens refused to open. The town of Marrow Hollow, once so proud of its fertile soil, now lay wrapped in silence, its fields brittle, its wells tasting faintly of iron. The earth had begun to breathe again. Children born that winter came into the world quiet, their hearts fluttering too fast, their eyes refusing to close. Their mothers woke in the night to find them staring at the ceiling, cooing softly to something no one else could see. The men took to drinking, the women to prayer, but both found themselves drawn to the Harrow ruins, unable to say why. There was something under that ground, something that hummed faintly, a pulse too deep for the ear, yet felt by every living thing in that valley. Even the dogs would not bark when they passed the old farm road. One morning, a hunter named Amos Cray ventured there. He returned 3 days later without his rifle or his voice. His wife found him sitting on the edge of the well, his hands trembling as though they'd forgotten how to hold anything. His eyes were not the same, clearer, brighter and wrong. When she begged him to speak, he whispered, "She's still birthing down there," and then he smiled, though tears streaked his face. Beneath the frozen soil, Elspeth Harrow was not dead. The earth had closed over her, yes, but it had not claimed her. It had fed her. The warmth that pulsed beneath the clay was not the sun's, it was the harvest she had sown, the communion of flesh she had midwifed into being. She no longer remembered her house, her tools, her prayers, only the rhythm of the womb, the contraction, the release, the wet opening of life struggling against silence. In that darkness, she felt them. Her children, the ones she'd lost, the ones she'd buried, the ones she'd fed to the pigs. They moved around her like fish in black water, brushing against her arms, her face. Sometimes she thought they whispered to her, their voices tiny and wet. Sometimes she thought she could feel their hands, pressing from within her skin, trying to come through again. She wasn't afraid. She was proud. The world above had always judged her, men with scripture and women with envy, but the soil had forgiven her. It had taken what no one else would take. It had listened. It had grown hungry, and now it had found its purpose. The valley began to rot from the inside out. Trees bled sap that smelled of copper. Roots broke through floors, pulsing like veins. The pigs that remained gave birth to things that didn't live long, but when they died, the ground absorbed them like rain. And then, one night in December, the earth split open. It began as a tremor beneath the well, a sigh, long and low. Then came the sound of tearing, like cloth ripping, followed by the deep, wet cry of something enormous being born. The moonlight flickered, the air thickened, and the soil rolled outward in waves, vomiting up mud and stone and bone. From the pit rose Elspeth, or what was left of her. Her body had changed, stretched, reshaped, remade by the children she had carried beneath the world. Her skin glowed faintly, thin as parchment, veins black with earth. Her hair hung in clumps of moss, her fingers webbed with scar tissue and root. She moved slowly, as if each motion remembered pain. But her eyes were full of stars. Behind her came the others, dozens at first, then hundreds. The stillborns she'd delivered, the infants that never cried, their tiny forms slick with clay, their mouths opening and closing, filling the air with the sound of 1,000 soft breaths. They surrounded her, crawling, pulling themselves through the mud toward the light. She looked upon them with something like love. For the first time, the valley saw what had been growing beneath it. Not a woman, not a demon, but a mother of flesh, the midwife of an unholy generation. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came forth was not a scream or a word. It was a lullaby. Slow, gentle, terrible. The same tune she had hummed over every cradle, every dying child, every stillborn she'd ever delivered. It spread across the fields, through the town, into the bones of every living soul. Those who heard it dropped to their knees, sobbing without knowing why. Mothers clutched their infants to their chests and felt them shudder. Men ran, but the sound followed, seeping into their dreams, their blood, their prayers. And as the song deepened, the valley began to give birth again. The ground convulsed. Barns split open as roots and sinew erupted from the foundations. The livestock screamed until their voices broke. From the river rose figures made of clay and bone, their faces forming and unforming in the moonlight. The sky itself seemed to bleed. Elspeth walked through it all barefoot, her steps leaving prints that smoked. She carried something in her arms, a shape swaddled in cloth that writhed faintly. When she reached the church, she found the bell still lying in the weeds. She knelt beside it and laid the bundle down. The cloth fell away, and the thing inside looked back at her. It was neither child nor beast. Its face was blank, its eyes wet and unblinking. But when it opened its mouth, it made a sound that was not a cry, but a wordless echo of her own heartbeat. Elspeth smiled through her tears. "My last," she whispered, though no one above could hear her. "My final one." Then she pressed her lips to its forehead. The earth trembled. The bell began to ring on its own, slow and heavy, the note rolling across the fields. Every window in Marrow Hollow shattered. Every light went out. When dawn came, the valley was empty. No houses. No people, only soil, smooth, rich and black, stretching endlessly where the town had been. Birds circled overhead but would not land. The air smelled faintly of milk and smoke. Years later, travelers passing through that part of Virginia spoke of the hollow. How no crops would grow there. How their horses refused to cross it. How at night the ground seemed to whisper. They said that sometimes when the wind shifted just right, they could hear a lullaby, soft, patient, maternal, rising from beneath their feet, and if they lingered too long, the earth beneath them pulsed once like a heartbeat, and the sound stopped. Because the midwife no longer needed to call. She had already delivered everything the land could bear, and now it was only waiting to feed again.